thank you all for joining us, and to those of you joining online. This is the Public Law Seminar Series hosted by the Global Centre for Democratic Constitutionalism here at UCL. And we have, I believe, well, actually, it may be sort of the English that I read in Victorian books, but it's like a corker of a program today. Because we have with us today Aileen, McHarg, and Chris McCorkindale, who are presenting their paper, Legislative Consent After Brexit. So I will do a quick round of introductions. They will have about 15 minutes to present the paper, and then we will have two august commentators who will each be a tight 10 minutes, and then open the conversation with you all for questions and further discussion. So Aileen McHarg is Professor of Public Law and Human Rights at Durham. Previously, she was Chair in Public Law at Strathclyde, and before that held posts at Glasgow and Bristol. And her co-author, Chris McCorkindale, is Reader in Law at Strathclyde, and he is an advisor to the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee of the Scottish Parliament during its current session. Commentating, we have Rick Rawlings here from UCL, Professor of Public Law, served as legal advisor to the House of Lords Constitution Committee on the Thomas Commission on Justice in Wales, and he currently serves on the Welsh Advisory Committee of the Law Commission and is working on a constitutional history of Wales. Keep your eye open for the book launch in due course. And finally, Akash Paun is Program Director for Devolution at the Institute for Government. In 2020, he was co-author of the report, Legislating by Consent, How to Revive and Reform the Sewel Convention. So a perfect grouping to discuss this paper. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Thank you for inviting us and for giving us a very strong incentive to make some progress with this project. So the paper that was circulated and we'll speak to today arises out of a British Academy funded project on legislative consent after Brexit. So we were interested in the impact of Brexit on the Sewel or Legislative Consent Convention, and just in case anyone doesn't know what that is the convention that the UK Parliament will not normally legislate with regard to devolved matters, except with the consent of the relevant devolved legislature. Our starting point for this project was the well-documented observation, documented amongst other people by Akash and the Institute for Government, that Brexit seemed to have significantly weakened the constitutional status of the convention, particularly in its ability to protect the devolved legislatures against unwanted interference by Westminster. But at the same time, we could see that the convention hadn't entirely collapsed. Consent was continuing to be sought and continuing to be granted routinely. So I looked back this morning at the proposal we put into the British Academy, which was slightly eye-opening. We set out with three questions. So one was, in what ways has Brexit changed the operation of the convention? Secondly, we wanted to know about what are the patterns in relation to the seeking and granting of consent. And thirdly, how and by whom are decisions relating to consent being taken? There's two elements to the project. Firstly, a documentary analysis. We're looking at all consent decisions across all three devolved legislatures, and that was important for us to include all three devolved legislatures in the project. So two pre-Brexit parliamentary sessions, 2014-15 and 15-16, and then skipping ahead to two post-Brexit sessions, 2021-22, 22-23. So that's a documentary analysis. That bit of the project is still not complete. It has been remarkably time consuming. I think we probably thought that would be the kind of bit that we do quite quickly and then we'd move on, but actually it's taken quite a long time. The second element has been interviews with, we've interviewed 32 current and former officials across the three sets of devolved institutions and at UK level who are involved in various ways in the legislative consent process. We have completed the interviews, but our last set of interviews was just at the end of February. So, so this is kind of very preliminary analysis. So this paper is drawing primarily on the interview data, but really do need to stress that this is preliminary analysis. The paper is also focused on the first of the three research questions. So in other words, what was the impact of Brexit on the legislative consent process? We found the interviews really fruitful. Nearly all of our interviewees were very cooperative and forthcoming, not absolutely all of them, but nearly all of them. We found clear support for a Brexit effect on consent, but whereas we might have been expecting a kind of black and white before and after contrast, we actually we were presented with a much more complex and nuanced story about how constitutional practice in this area had evolved. So what we're going to do, Chris will talk a little bit about the Brexit effect. I'll then say a little bit about what those nuances are, and then we'll conclude, as the paper concludes, with a kind of fourth research question that we tacked on because our interviews took place after the UK general election. If you recall, that was much earlier than we expected. We took the opportunity in the interviews to ask another question, which is, well, have things changed since the general election? So Chris will finish off with that point. So
okay,
Chris.
Thanks. And too late to add to your introduction, but I had sight of an email between government officials this morning that described me as the Robin to Aileen's Batman. So it's time for the sidekick. So in terms of the impact of Brexit, I'm going to pick out three key headline questions, i.e. things we wanted to understand through the interview process. And I'm going to add a fourth question that doesn't appear in the paper yet. So Rick and Akash won't have had sight of this, so I'll spend a wee bit of time on that first. So the question that doesn't yet appear in the paper, but I thought was quite a fruitful finding from the research interviews is, what were the origins of the convention? We want to understand, why do we have the Sewel Convention in the first place? What is it that lies behind the statement that's often quoted of Lord Sewel in the House of Lords? And what we found through the interviews is that whilst you might expect that the convention forms part of a carefully, collaboratively designed constitutional project within the Labour government, in fact, the opposite's true. So the Sewel Convention was, in fact, a defensive reaction by the Scotland office, Scottish office, sorry, to the late insertion elsewhere in government into the Scotland Bill of what's now Section 28(7). So that statement that restates Parliament's residual right to legislate in devolved areas. The Scottish office was caught by surprise by this insertion. It hadn't been a feature of previous attempts to legislate for devolution. They said, quote unquote, it should not have been there. But it having been there, it needed to be constrained. That power needed to be regulated. They accepted it couldn't be regulated by a legal mechanism because of all the constitutional baggage that comes with parliamentary sovereignty. So it would have to be a political mechanism that constrained it. And I mean, it was told to be as simple as flicking through Calvert, learning from the Northern Irish experience in terms of how a convention emerged and operated there, slipping that to Lord Sewel to present in his statement to the Lords, and then quote unquote, and that was that. So it was as easy as that. But the significant thing is that whilst the origins of Sewel did recognise the cooperative function, the collaborative function of Sewel, this idea that it might sometimes be sensible for the UK Parliament to legislate in devolved areas for all sorts of reasons by agreement. The actual reason why the convention exists in the first place is a defensive one. It's to defend devolved autonomy from the unwelcome intrusion of UK legislation in devolved areas. And that's supported by that explicit reference to Northern Ireland that was made by Lord Sewel himself in the Lords, because as the convention operated between 21 and 72, it was actually even more firmly expressed than as the Sewel Convention. The UK Parliament would not legislate in relation to transfer matters unless by the invitation of the devolved government. So I really want to stress that the origins are defensive in nature, albeit recognising a collaborative function for the Sewel process. The second thing we wanted to know was, well, given there's no legal bite to the convention, given that the UK government has the weight of parliamentary sovereignty restated in section 2872, just for good measure, behind it, why make an effort at all to reach agreement with the devolved? Why not simply wield that power? And we were given a number of reasons why that would be. First of all, that the goodwill that existed between the Scottish government, and as it came to be the Welsh government and the UK government to make devolution work, right? This goodwill that we don't even have to think about the political consequences for breach. We don't have to think about what happens if consent is withheld or consent decisions are overridden, because the prevailing attitude between governments was, quote unquote, let's not go there. Let's not, we don't even map out, we don't game out the consequences. We didn't think about it at all because we were just willing not to even test the proposition, not to go there. Secondly, we were told that Sewel operated fairly frequently and uncontroversially in this period because of good practice, that there was very early engagement with legislation, that there were good faith negotiations aiming at a solution, which would include, on 2 occasions when consent was withheld, carve out for the devolved from UK legislative scheme rather than consent decision overrides. And these discussions took place in private spaces. So you could effectively manage the causes of disagreement at an early stage with no surprises down the line when there was a need for a formal consent decision. And then third, that there's a psychological component to the Sewel Convention, that the UK government felt bound at the outer limits to pull back in ways that were a construct of the convention existing itself, in ways that wouldn't have existed had a convention not been there in the first place, that they wouldn't test the political consequences of breach. Again, rolling back into this idea, well, we're not even going to go there. And then the third question is, well, why Brexit and why is the 2018 Act, sorry, the Withdrawal Act, a key turning point in all of this, in this story, where previously you had frequent requests for consent that was frequently given and uncontroversially given? Why was 2018 a turning point? The key answer to that was the enactment of the EU withdrawal bill without devolved consent, and in particular the fact that that extended to Scotland without Scotland's consent. Previously, the expectation had been that if Scotland withheld its consent to the EU withdrawal bill, that the UK would, as it did in previous experience in Scotland and Northern Ireland, would carve out the devolved from that, or certainly the Scottish area from that UK legislation to allow the Scottish Parliament to legislate itself. That didn't happen on this occasion. Instead, the consent decision of the Scottish Parliament was overridden, the legislation was applied to Scotland, and this caused what we were told words like shock, anger amongst the devolved governments. More so in Scotland and Wales, less so in Northern Ireland, where the institutions weren't functioning, and where, as Aileen might say later, where they felt they had bigger fish to fry in terms of the impact of Brexit on devolution in Northern Ireland. For the UK government, they said, well, this isn't a breach at all. This is squarely within the 4 corners of the convention, which says that we will not normally seek consent, legislate without consent, but they described this as a not normal situation, which justified that the exception rather than the rule. So the Scottish government's response to that is that there was a clear breach here, that it's one thing to say that a situation is not normally and therefore not seek consent and legislate without, and another thing to seek consent for the Scottish Parliament or any of the devolved legislatures to withhold that consent, and then for the legislation to override the consent decision of a democratically elected legislature. So to a certain extent, there's a sense of the government's talking past one another about even what the convention means and how it constrains. And then the final question is why post 2018 does the settlement now, quote unquote, feel completely different to that goodwill, early engagement, psychologically driven glory age of the Sewel Convention? And we were given a number of reasons for this. One, goodwill is gone, right? The governments have politically entrenched views and opposed views about Brexit, and that removes the space for goodwill. The governments are now willing to, having gone there once in relation to the 2018 Act, the governments are now willing to go there in terms of testing what would happen if consent is withheld or overridden. Good practice has been eroded, so the rush to legislate for Brexit has often meant that legislation is made late, often comes in a condition that is not quite ready, but which nevertheless the legislation is introduced and fixed after the fact. And where, because there are entrenched views and because the government is getting, the devolved governments are getting late sight of legislation as devolution analysis, they're no longer fixing these problems in private spaces, but it's pushed into the public arena. In other words, it's not like even a fear of political consequences, it's actually taking political advantage of being seen to stand up for UK or devolved interests that might drive this in Brexit cases. The psychological constraint is gone. We've tested, as the Scottish Government said, we were exposed by the 2018 Act because the UK Government realised that if we did push at the boundaries, if we did test the political consequences are none. There was no rise in support for independence, or no significant rise in support for independence. The threats by the Scottish Government to withhold consent to every piece of Brexit legislation, no matter its merits, quickly gave way to practical considerations of the need to legislate. And actually, one of the things that Scottish Government officials stress is the political consequences. The Sewel was overridden, or the consent decision was overridden, and nobody cared. That was the thing that really struck the Scottish Government, I think, that when it really came to it, nobody cared. As I've already mentioned, this idea of the governments talking past one another about clear breach versus the view of the UK government that Sewel has never been breached, that every breach falls within this category of not normal. There is the unknowingness of Brexit, the fact that the UK government doesn't know what it's legislating for necessarily, it doesn't know what powers it might need in the other side of Brexit, has lent to what I think the House of Lords has called lazy drafting techniques. Will take broad powers in devolved areas with no requirement to seek the consent of the devolved governments, and that is the major cause of disagreement and cause of devolved governments to withhold consent, the lack of consent requirements in relation to concurrent powers, UK powers in devolved areas. And what we've also seen, quite interestingly, is that this is not, that these developments, late sight of legislation, the lack of psychological constraint, the late sight of devolution analysis, the sorts of powers that are being taken in Brexit legislation are not contained to Brexit context itself. We're now seeing spillover of these patterns into non-Brexit context. In other words, if the view of the UK government is, well, all of this just fits into the not normal box, that narrative is undermined, I think, by the spillage into situations that are more normal policy disputes. So we're seeing more frequent requests for consent, more frequently consent is being withheld, more frequently consent decisions being overridden, and these are some of the drivers, I think, towards that.
Okay,
1 minute.
right, 1 minute.
Oh,
Okay,
sorry, is that-
so yeah, so caveats. I will just say what the caveats are. So 3 sets of caveats to that idea of Brexit as a big turning point. One is we actually found a lot of continuity. So particularly in terms of the facilitative function of the convention, a continued willingness to cooperate, and across all of the devolved institutions, reporting of pragmatism reigning. They're not really that bothered about the constitutional dimension of this. The primary question is, do we agree on the policy? And if so, consent will be given. Also continuity in a more negative sense, in that you can find evidence of some of these problems that we think of as post-Brexit problems. They are there in the earlier period, but sometimes less visible. Caveat 2 is a more complex set of reasons why problems have arisen. So the Scotland Act 2018, which put Sewel on a statutory footing, we started to see there disagreements about, well, what exactly does this convention mean? What is it that we're giving recognition to? Our interviews pointed to the Scotland Act 2012 as a turning point, at which point they said consent ceased to be about bureaucratic issues, technical issues, became much more of a negotiating tool. That is then carried over to the Brexit process, and gives rise to a perception which we found at devolved level as well as UK level that the devolves had been pushing their luck a wee bit. That, you know, they were using this process to make points sometimes rather than focusing on very narrow technical issues about the impact on devolved matters, and some local factors, particularly in Northern Ireland, as Chris has already mentioned, some particular reasons why consent is difficult in Northern Ireland, but also less important in Northern Ireland. And then finally, the impact of Brexit has not been entirely negative. Actually, it has been the catalyst for some positive changes, particularly around about transparency, some improvements in intergovernmental relations, the big change being the statement as from 2021 in House of Lords third reading, that if consent hasn't been reached, the minister has to stand up and say, well, why not? And our interviewees in the UK Parliament and UK government seem to think that that did make a difference, although they were quite vague as to what the difference was. But to caveat that caveat, the process is still very, very problematic. It is very untransparent. It's very difficult for the devolved legislatures and the UK legislature to play any meaningful role in this process. It continues to be one which is dominated by governments rather than legislatures. Shall we stop there?
That would be perfect. Thank you so much. All right, Rick, to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I think this is, I want to say, first of all, thanks very much, Aileen and Chris. And going back to Batman and Robin, I always thought Robin was rather a key player. But that was my sort of childhood view, but I leave that for you two to work out on the train going back. Okay, so I think this is a really, it's a model of clarity, this paper. If you look at the headings, right, it just takes you through, you know, the different stages of the argument. And any PhD student watching this or listening, just have a look at the way in which this paper is structured. It'll tell you a lot. It's also what I think Erin would call a work in progress. So my comments are in a way directed to that, and I hope that some of my sort of concerns are helpful in that regard, actually, because I do think they can be taken on board. So two things to start off with. I'm, as you know, going to say this somewhat from a Welsh perspective, but I want to say that because I want to put to you that this is a rather Scottish paper. Right. You've obviously gone out and spoken to officials around the different devolves, and you've obviously talked to the centre. But I couldn't help feeling that there was something of a Scottish mindset in this, and I'll come back on why I might think that. And second, I think there's an issue around methodology. I mean, I just see the Sewel Convention as the whole discussion around Sewel as immensely political. And by talking to officials, you've tilted it away from that. And understandably so, you wanted to focus on the routine and so on and so forth. But I do think from time to time there's a tension in the paper because of the methodology on the one hand and the subject matter on the other. And I'm not sure that you've always got over that tension. So if we jump forward then into the impact section, there are some interesting nuggets and some interesting stories are clearly coming out from the interviews. I was particularly interested in what Chris was saying about the expectation apparently among Scottish government officials that the Conservative government was going to play very nice around the 2018 Act. Well, you know, I scribbled in the margin "dream on," and you know, I do think that expectation in particular needs some drilling down into, and that to me is a good example of the Scottishness of the paper. right? That's not the way it was being seen in other parts of the UK, let's put it that way. I thought too that it's just a general point about this this section on impact. I just thought the political perspective was undercooked, and in particular, it doesn't unpack the evolving approach in central government in the context of Brexit. I really do think you need to be thinking about how things were happening under different prime ministers, right? And I wouldn't want to lump Theresa May together with Boris Johnson for these purposes. And I think that if you went down that route, it would really enrich the paper. I like the legal constitutional explanations going on there. I thought the idea of erosion was very good, and I think your key point around the importance of the debate around concurrent powers is absolutely spot on. Certainly, you know, from my experience, that was a real concern that the debates had, and I think you're enriching the literature by really sort of emphasizing that point. And if you could bring out some key illustrations, I think that would be very powerful. Coming to the qualifications, excuse me, I might call it contesting the basic hypothesis. I guess part of my problem is that I wouldn't have started with your hypothesis. My hypothesis would have been no clean break. It would have been, yes, of course, Brexit really tested things, you know, in incredible ways, but that the narrative that you're opposing, I never could really buy into in the first place. So, and I was very struck with that as your starting point. That's not what my starting point would have been, but there we are. And again, I think that the political perspective is richer in the qualifications section. But again, I think there's something to be said about Anglo-centric notions of the Union, an attempt under Boris Johnson in particular to revert to an older sort of British tradition of sort of the constitutional viewpoint, as it were, and the dominance of Westminster and parliamentary sovereignty. And again, if you were to distinguish different prime ministerships, I think you could really kind of bring that home. I thought too that there was a paper behind a paper. It's where you ended, Aileen, and I'm with you on the real problems of Sewel in terms of the Legislative Consent Convention, in terms of the role of parliaments, both Westminster and the devolves, right? I'm not sure that belongs in this paper. And if it does belong in this paper, and if you've got comments on it from officials, that would be very valuable. But at the moment, I can't help feeling that it's a bit sort of jammed on to a really innovative piece of research, right? And I don't get the join, right? And you make the point, you've got it italicized in the introduction. You've got this big point then made in the body of the text, and then in your penultimate paragraph, you're clearly signaling, right, this big issue around the role of parliaments. But it's not at the moment, to me, the sort of the chief outcome, the chief result of the research that you've actually done, right? So I think that there's a tension there. Coming on to Labour, Well, yes, I thought you dealt with Gordon Brown very nicely. And you know, this is Akash type territory, memorandum of understanding, and you know, Institute for Government. So I'll leave all of that.
That's a compliment. I'm not sure.
Like a lot of what I say, double-edged. So I leave that one to you, Akash. But I want to come back on my Scottishness point, which of course is a bit of a tease, right? But I suppose I thought, well, how would I have done this paper if I'd had the sort of the energy and the brilliance to have thought about doing it in the first place? And I thought with my Welsh perspective, I might have come up with rather different periods, because you've got a pre-Brexit period, a Brexit period, and then a post-Brexit period. And I thought to myself, well, if I was doing that with my Welsh hat on, I wouldn't do it in that way. I would have a couple more periods. I would start with Labour hegemony. And I accept, of course, that that doesn't play out so well in Scotland for obvious reasons as it does in Wales. But just thinking about what Chris was saying about the origins of the convention, I think that's really important, because when I was doing research on concordats in 1997, 1998, they weren't really bothered, right? Because it was all going to be sorted, quote, inside the party, unquote, right? And so I think when you're thinking about origins, right, you're going to have to bring in party hegemony at that period. And then my next periods would be cohabitation, and I would be thinking about the Conservatives from, you know, coalition, and then Cameron as my first period of cohabitation. And then my second period of cohabitation would be the Brexit period, thinking about the different prime ministers. And then I would be coming back to hegemony again, as it were, with the election of the new government and so on and so forth. And of course, it may well be that that way of thinking isn't really going to survive the next devolved elections, you know, that are coming next year. But I think that there are different ways of organizing this material and seeing different timings and arrangements depending where you're standing in the Constitution. And I think that there is a Scottish subtext to what you're doing, which is not a criticism, right? But clearly what you're trying to do is sort of get out of Scotland, as it were, and to do it much more broadly. And I just query how successful you've been in doing that.
Perfect, excellent, great timing, thank you very much, and Akash.
Thanks, Erin. So yeah, good afternoon, great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So I really enjoyed the paper. I think I don't think I'm going to be able to give such constructive analytical comments on how you might restructure the paper in the way that Rick has just so expertly done. But I'll make some broad observations on the content of the paper and what I think are the most interesting trends and points about this issue. So yeah, I mean, I think the evidence base that the paper's based on is great, and I really look forward to the final version of the paper, where I'm sure you're going to make more richer use of the interviews, because that I think is going to be the really new contribution. I mean, I think the story you've told very clearly is, you know, it's expertly done, but it's a little bit more familiar. But you've actually gone out and spoken to people inside the system about how they interpret and apply and do or don't feel bound by the convention, and how that's changed since and as a result of Brexit. And I think that's going to be it's going to be, you know, really fascinating to see some more of that evidence brought to light in support of the arguments you're making. And before I go on to some of my actually more prepared comments, I just also wanted to dwell on that distinction between how the Sewel Convention has changed since and as a result of Brexit. And, you know, obviously those are two different things in terms of what's the causal claim you're making. And I'll come back to that towards the end. But I think that might be something you explore a bit more directly in the paper and in setting out your conclusions. Because I think, you know, as a research question, it's good, and I quite like that, somewhat contrary to what Rick was saying, that sort of binary focus on how did it work pre and how did it work post Brexit. I think that makes for a nice, you know, clear structure and gives the paper a good focus. But the change on one side, from one side to the other, is not automatically a direct result of Brexit. It's also to do with, as Rick was saying, political choices and strategic decisions taken by successive governments. So those would be my sort of just starting points. So yeah, just running through what I think are the most interesting things going on here. So yeah, I mean, I think the evidence shows there has been that clear shift. Pre-Brexit, we had not a single case of passage of legislation without consent where the UK government itself recognised that Sewel applied. Meanwhile, there'd been around about 200 acts of parliament passed with the consent of at least one of the devolved legislatures over the first 2 decades of devolution. And Brexit, the 2018 Act, I think, reached the dam. We've now seen the figures are in the paper, more than a dozen instances of legislation without consent. And yes, we always knew that was legally possible, but until it happened, it was seen as politically, if not quite inconceivable, very unlikely, and something to be avoided. And I mean, the paper makes the point that pre-Brexit, Sewel had such an aura, if you want to put it like that, that the devolved authorities did not even feel the need to wargame what would happen if consent was overridden. I think Chris used that line in his presentation as well. I personally recall a seminar we hosted at the Institute for Government must have been 2017, to discuss how the impasse around the EU withdrawal bill might be resolved between, well, particularly the Scottish government and UK government, probably before the Welsh had given consent as well. And I was chairing the discussion. I remember mentioning in passing that, well, in principle, of course, you know, Parliament could just pass this without consent. And we all knew that to be legally true. But even in saying it, I felt a little bit of sort of diffidence, because I was like, wait a minute, but we have, you know, Sewel Convention would prevent that, wouldn't it? Although legally it was possible. And I remember the view in the room was like, oh no, surely that we'd never reach that point. There was a Scottish government representative there who very much thought that was pretty much unthinkable. And that, I think, was, you know, that was how it was treated at that point. Sewel did have genuine power in the defensive role that the authors, that Chris and Aileen, described. And I mean, as the paper sets out, you know, the Scottish government used that power to great effect in negotiations around the 2016 Act in particular, though ironically, perhaps, they didn't use their leverage at that point to seek amendments to how the Act recognised Sewel itself. And the focus was much more on the fiscal framework and securing amendments to the funding formula, which wasn't even part of the legislation. Which is quite an interesting oddity of how that actually played out, the consent process in that case. And that was then replicated to some extent with the Wales Act after that. But it's clear, though, that I skipped that. Sorry. Yeah, but I think it's clear that the UK government in that period, even though they very deliberately recognised Sewel in statute in that minimalist, non-judiciable form, in that period, as per the paper, they were very loath to go there and legislate without consent. And that's why we saw their incredibly kind of comprehensive efforts to reach agreement around the withdrawal bill. That was a period of pretty extensive intergovernmental relations. The Brexit committee meetings chaired by David Lidington or whoever it was at that point met very regularly. And I think, you know, they did try and made significant amendments to the legislation in light of devolved concerns, sufficient to secure Welsh consent, but of course ultimately not consent from Holyrood. And that led eventually to the, I think, very reluctant conclusion in Whitehall that there was no alternative but to proceed regardless. There's another irony as well, I think, that the elements of that legislation that were the sticking point, unless I misrecall, were ultimately never used,
right,
those
yeah.
freezing powers. So it's another kind of irony of history, if you like. But yes, once that breach had taken place, I think the psychological hold, as the paper puts it, of Sewel was diminished, and subsequently it was a lot easier to conceive of legislation without consent. So I think that's, you know, that's a convincing story, and is certainly, in my view, that was a real sea change moment. But the paper does also convincingly set out the ways in which that change can be overstated, and there was, and there has been, you know, a huge amount of continuity of practice as well. And I think in some respects, it's, you know, it's surprising that Sewel has survived at all. It could easily have collapsed altogether, especially in that period referenced before, when Scottish ministers said they wouldn't give consent to any Brexit-related legislation. And there was a lot of that, and we know that was interpreted pretty broadly, what was Brexit legislation. And that actually gave UK ministers a reason, or an excuse, you might say, to disengage and not take the consent process seriously themselves. So I think that was a point when it really could have collapsed. I mean, Alistair Jack, as Secretary of State for Scotland, he was interviewed by the IFG, by colleagues of mine, and in relation to the UK Internal Market Act, he said, I quote, "I didn't mind that they, the Scottish Parliament, well, all the devolves actually, that they weren't giving legislative consent, because they'd made it very clear they weren't giving legislative consent for any Brexit-related legislation." So that was kind of the attitude in that point, I think. But both sides did ultimately see those practical benefits of continuing to engage, and to and so the facilitative function, as described, of Sewel has continued to function, albeit with many of those same limitations and frustrations as existed pre-Brexit. Someone, I think, is signalling my time.
That was like a 1 minute.
Wait, is it?
count.
Okay, fine,
Yeah,
I'll
it
accept
was
that.
a-
So switched. Yeah, no, thanks. So yeah, there's lots more I could say about what I really liked about the paper. As I said, I look forward to the final version. I mean, one point I would make, and this I think echoes some of what Rick was saying, is I'd be interested in the authors, in you guys' reflections. Don't know, I'm calling you the authors, like I don't know you. Chris and Aileen's reflections on that wider political context, the wider context of UK-devolved relations that Sewel was just a part of, and how that relationship has changed in this period as a result of deliberate shifts of strategy, rather than just as a maybe necessary, or whether or not I think it's necessary, but rather than just as an adjustment to Brexit. And that goes back to the point I made before, since Brexit is not the same as a result of Brexit. And so I'm thinking in particular of Boris Johnson, muscular unionism, that period, particularly post-2019 election, when, as it was described to me, you know, Downing Street kind of centre directive around Whitehall, kind of instructing departments to very much think in UK-wide terms, even if they were departments where, you know, we'd sort of previously thought of them as primarily English departments. And that was, we saw that reflected in practice, not just in the breaches of Sewel, if you call them breaches, but also in things like the Shared Prosperity Fund, the Levelling Up Fund, being unveiled as UK-wide programmes, rather than what was expected and what definitely would have happened in previous administrations, England-only programmes which incurred Barnett consequentials. Whole load of other elements of things going on in this period as well, of course, you know, gender reform and other kind of uses of executive powers to block devolved actions in ways that we really hadn't seen before. So yes, so I think that the undermining of Sewel was part of a wider shift in how the government of the day chose to interpret its role as government of the whole UK. And yes, maybe a reversion to a kind of earlier conception of the union, of parliamentary sovereignty and so on. So I think that's a really interesting part of the picture that could be further explored, as well as, yes, to what extent are we now seeing a shift back in the other direction? I think there's some signs there has been a reset of relations. They've certainly, the government, Keir Starmer, on bills like Great British Energy Bill, made amendments and made sure that they have secured consent in light of devolved concerns. On the other hand, they're not rolling back things like the Internal Markets Act. And I don't think fundamentally there's been a shift away from maybe that broader conception of them as a UK government when it comes to things like the economic growth mission, which has sort of replaced the levelling up strategy. So maybe the jury's still out a bit. Sorry to go.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. All right, there you have a wealth to choose from. So the floor is now has returned to you. I think the third time I've done it. Being myself, and then we will open for questions, and people online, please put your questions into the chat. It's a webinar, so I will read the questions out loud if you pop them in, but 10 minutes in response.
Okay.
Or fewer if you'd like more time for questions. Your choice.
So thanks both of you for very, very helpful comments. You're absolutely right. This is very much work in progress. And our focus when we were writing this was on the interview material. So some of the background stuff is I agree, not as well brought out as it needs to be. I just wanted to push back on two things. So one thing that you said, Rick, and one thing that you said, Akash. So Rick, in relation to this is a very Scottish focus, and you wouldn't have started there. I mean, the narrative of Brexit as a turning point, Brexit as having broken the convention, that is not an exclusively Scottish narrative at all. I mean, it's actually come out quite powerfully from the Welsh government. So I think, as in terms of justifying our starting assumption, I think that does apply certainly across Scotland and Wales, maybe less so for Northern Ireland, but that was part of the thing. That was something that we did hope to bring out with some of the nuances. You are absolutely right, though, that pre-Brexit legislative consent was more difficult in Wales than it was in Scotland and Northern Ireland. There is a lot more overt disagreement, but the disagreement is primarily in that period around about whether consent is required or not. And that's the circumstances in which you get pre-Brexit, you get the override where the Welsh government has recommended not giving consent, but the UK government says we don't think consent is required, so we carry on. So that's a slightly different thing. But yeah, in that Welsh material, there is that's where you find most of the evidence of this really didn't work very well at all. The point I wanted to push back to you, Akash, was your distinction between things that have happened since Brexit and things that are a result of Brexit. I mean, I think that's an important distinction, but I think it's a hard one to draw. And I'm minded of some point last year, was it? I gave evidence to the SEAP committee in Holyrood by myself, which was great fun. And I was talking about a range of different Brexit effects, and I included the Section 35 order, gender recognition, muscular unionism as a Brexit effect. And I got absolutely jumped on by one of the Tory MSPs. But I still think I'm right. I still think that is a Brexit effect, albeit a more diffuse Brexit effect, because what Brexit has done is unleash a broader set of political constitutional developments which extend beyond the particular factual context of Brexit itself. So yes, I take your point, but I don't think there is quite such a clear-cut distinction between.
I think you could expand that argument, because it's not probably automatically obvious to people why that would be the case. Like why the decision to block the gender reform legislation is in that way linked to Brexit. I mean, I think there's a totally legitimate point you're making there. I'd probably be maybe more open to the idea that there's still you know, it still reflected specific decisions taken by a government of the day that took a particular view of the evolution. That wasn't, I don't know if it's automatically because of Brexit, but yeah, I think that'd be an interesting strand to explore in my view.
Thanks.
So I guess I would just say in relation to the bit about Parliament, I think there is a role for it here. I agree that we've maybe still to tease out exactly what it is, but as I was listening to you explain that point, I think where I see it is there's a key point that you have two functions, cooperative and defensive. The defensive function has been obliterated by the legislative consent overrides, successive legislative consent overrides. Cooperative function still works, and when we're working to restore Sewel in the post-Labour era, the focus is very much on focusing on where collaboration works, where it works, and not saying very much at all about restoring the defensive function. And history tells us that's not enough. And that goes to Parliament, because so we do have interview data on this, and the interview data that comes back is that amongst those who didn't care that Sewel was breached was Parliament. So clerks in parliaments would tell us, actually, parliamentarians themselves, there is no parliament. Now, one of them said there is no such thing as parliament. There's a collection of MSPs or assembly members who act on their own political or individual interests, but there's no one who's standing up to defend devolution and devolved autonomy in itself. And I think that feeds into, you cannot restore that a truly defensive function of Sewel unless you can impress upon not just that nobody cares, but Parliament certainly has to care. And I think the concern is just now that it doesn't. So we need to, I think, maybe tease that back out and link it to that defensive function.
I mean, just to pick up on that, something that came out of the interviews with current government officials is that despite what was being said by the Scottish government and the Welsh government about the need to, greatly strengthen Sewel, we need much more formality, we need to define what not normally means or remove it, we need to have properly legally enforceable rules. The governments seem quite happy as long as things work better now. They're not, they kind of forgotten about all that. And the danger of this, and then this was said to us quite explicitly by one person in particular, I think, we don't want to have arguments in public anymore. We want to keep things behind closed doors. And actually, the increased transparency around this process has been probably a positive byproduct of Sewel, as from a democratic point of view. And the real danger is, the governments are happy because they are being consulted, and the phone is being answered, and that just pushes the parliaments out again. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely concede this paper is very, 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 very much first draft. But I do think I agree with Chris that this point does belong there.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our authors. Thank you to our commentators. The American poet laureate Billy Collins has a wonderful poem on the poetry seminar, and in the middle of it, he says, maybe this is 2 poems or 3 poems, or maybe it isn't a poem at all. And I think what we have here with your piece of work is an entire book and a research agenda to go forth on, not just one paper. So we will look forward to reading more and hopefully to having you back.
Oh, the whole implication of that isn't or not a paper at all.
Well, it's unfortunately it might be a book or 2 or 3. So congratulations, thank you again, and we will see you soon.